Hello, everybody. Just the silence that you're going to have for the next 30 to 60 seconds is just that we're waiting for everybody to populate from the waiting room. We'll be getting started in just a minute. Did I just say the silence that you're hearing? Okay, let's get started. Welcome and good morning, everybody. My name is Danny Schultz, and on behalf of the Westchester Jewish Council and the 5 Synagogues of the White Plains Israel Affairs Committee, I'm honored to be introducing today's event. The WJC is an umbrella organization representing 135 Jewish organizations, schools, and synagogues in Westchester, the 8th largest Jewish community in the U.S., totaling 150,000 citizens. I'm proud to be a board member of the WJC, chair of our Israel Affairs Committee, and delighted to be hosting our discussion program today. The topic, Keinon speaking on reflections on Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel at 73. Where are we? Today's event is also being sponsored and originated, I would say, by the 5 synagogues of the White Plains Israel Action Committee. Those synagogues are Keinon Shalom, the Hebrew Institute, Columnist, Temple Israel Center, and the Young Israel of White Plains. Joining us from the Israel Action Committee is Dean Ungar, a member of the Hebrew Institute and chair of the Israel Affairs Committee of the 5 Synagogues of White Plains. Dean, take it away.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Danny. I just want to take a few moments before we begin. I want to thank our co-sponsor, the Westchester Jewish Council, and especially Laurie Kurlander, Helene Schoenbrum, and Pam Goldstein for being so instrumental in setting up the logistics and getting the word out. And also thanks to Danny for moderating today's event. I want to thank all of you for joining. I think it's going to be well worth your time. I just want to say a couple of words about the Israel Action Committee of the 5 synagogues, which Danny just mentioned who it includes. The really important thing, I think, in our view, is that it includes all the denominations, conservative, reconstructionist, reform, and the Orthodox movement, all working together. And it's been going on for 20 years since the Intifada began in 2000. We should be very proud of this. It's an example of cooperation and goodwill that really is a model. Not only, it's great for White Plains, but it's a model for the wider Jewish community and beyond. And over the years, we've raised money for things like medical equipment for Bika Cholim, and we purchased an ambulance. We've had many events, many speakers of all sorts of viewpoints. We've had debates, we've had cultural things, and we're very, very pleased to have Keinon here today to speak about Israel. Where are we as we contemplate Yom Ha'atzmaut, which is coming later this week. So with that, again, thanks everyone for being here. And I'm going to turn it back to Danny.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you very much. Wow, this is truly a pleasure to be hosting a conversation with you, Herb. I'm going to run through your bio quickly because we're down to only 56 minutes now of our event today. Herb Keinon is a senior contributing editor and analyst with the Jerusalem Post, writing extensively on diplomacy, politics, and Israeli society. Herb has been at the paper for 35 years, 20 of those as its diplomatic correspondent, and during this time has covered up close the major stories that have shaped the nation of Israel for more than 3 decades. The first Intifada to the withdrawal from Gaza, the massive immigration of Soviet Jews to the Rabin assassination, the Ariel Sharon premiership to that of the many premierships of Benjamin Netanyahu, and of course, several elections. Keinon also writes a popular monthly light column on daily life in Israel. A collection of these columns, French Fries and Pita, can be bought on Amazon, by the way, was published in 2014. So he is both a funny, serious guy and a seriously funny guy. Keinon lectures widely in Israel and around the world on political and diplomatic developments in the country. Originally from Denver, Keinon has a BA in political science from the University of Colorado at Boulder and an MA in journalism from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. He has lived in Israel for more than 37 years, has 4 children, and lives with his wife in Ma'ale Adumim, just outside of Jerusalem. Herb, I'm going to let you take it away. I'll start with one very quick question to set things up, which is, what still resonates with you and excites you about Israel and Zionism? And you've been at this game for a while, so you have a great retrospective as both an Israeli and an American. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Danny. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Look, we're after our fourth election. We're perhaps on our way to a fifth election. It's not an easy place to be. What can it be compared to? You know, y'all, sometimes you go to the bar mitzvah of a friend's kid. And when you go to a bar mitzvah of a friend's kid, the parents inevitably always praise the kid to the sky, right? I wrote about it once in one of the lighter columns I wrote. I've been at celebrations where it's difficult to tell the difference between Chaim Yankel, the bar mitzvah boy, and Mother Teresa, the saint, right? The boy does his homework, he helps his siblings, is good to the elderly, visits the ill, he does his chores, is kind to animals, he eats his greens, and has just finished all 6 tractates of the Mishnah. Now, I always walk away from those events not uplifted necessarily at the good fortune that such a youngster walks in our midst, but rather depressed that I have 4 kids and not one of them is like that, right? Even combined, they're not like that. And how does this connect to what we're living through now? Because what we're living through now is the bar mitzvah speech platitudes in reverse, right? It's everything is bad. It's as if the bar mitzvah boy's parents would stand up and say, this kid on the joyful occasion, they say that this kid is actually a louse, a lazy no goodnik who doesn't do his homework, doesn't eat his greens or care for anybody but himself, right? And that essentially is what we heard about this country now since December 2018, when we first started this endless election cycle, right? The elections, as you know, right? You know, going through elections in the States, elections are a time when what you hear about is how lousy everything is, right? How bad everything is, how the country is completely on the wrong track, how the country is racist or cruel or lacking compassion or losing its soul, that we're collectively kind of walking off the plank, right? That's what you hear from those who are running against Bibi and Netanyahu. And Netanyahu says, well, everything's great, but if you don't reelect me, everything is going to turn into dirt. Now, the problem is if you hear that stuff long enough, right? And we've been hearing that mantra now for the last 2 years, or since December 2018, when we started this election cycle, you start hearing this long enough and you start believing it. Hence, my topic for this afternoon is Israel at 73. On Thursday, please God, we'll be celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut. Where are we? Where are we? And I think in looking at that question, we have to kind of take a step back and get some perspective. And that's something that this country, or those of us who live here, always lack or seem to lack in that perspective. I'm afraid that many of us, both in Israel and abroad, often lose the forest for the trees. We get so caught up in the everyday news, which often looks so bleak and distressing, that we lose sight of the bigger picture. Israel obviously is not the same pristine vision everyone envisioned 73 years ago. A lot has happened in the interim. In the intervening 7 decades, we face a harsh, tough, and bitter reality, a reality that sometimes forces us to compromise some of our values. Perhaps we haven't lived up to our own lofty expectations, but, and this is my overarching theme today, the sky isn't falling, right? It's not falling despite the fact that we can't form a government. It's not falling despite the missteps we took dealing with the pandemic, with Corona, though we're doing better than most. It's not falling despite the stalemate with the Palestinians and despite the US restarting talks with the Iranians and despite our internal rifts and the problems with the judiciary and all the crime and all the corruption. Nevertheless, let's face it, it's not the same country that many of us grew up on, right? Our inability to form a government now is long past the 2 Jews, 3 opinions kind of cute or quaint scenario, right? It's a serious problem right now. It's a serious dysfunctionality. Our inability to stop the rocket attacks, the intermittent rocket attacks from Gaza isn't exactly the 6-day war. There was no Entebbe raid a few years ago to free Gilad Shalit. And Israeli corruption, unfortunately, makes the news abroad much more today than Israeli valor. What people both in Israel and abroad in the States are asking, I think, is simple. What's happened to Israel? What's happened to Israel we took pride in? Is this the land that we prayed and hoped for? We hear it increasingly among segments of American Jewry, disenchanted with Benjamin Netanyahu and the rightward lurch of Israeli politics, and there has been a rightward lurch of Israeli politics. We read constantly about the alienation of Jewish millennials from Israel. What's happened to the old Israel? This is not our Israel. We can't identify with this country anymore. We hear this all the time. And believe me, as one who chose to live here some 37 years ago, and by so doing put my children, especially my boys, my 3 boys, in harm's way, the question of whether or not this is the country we prayed for is never far from my mind, right? I mean, I came to live here by choice. I put my kids in this situation. Is this what I wanted for them? In order to answer the question, like I said, we need perspective. And what's so beautiful and I think unique about this particular time of the Jewish calendar is that it forces us to step back a bit and put things in perspective, right? We came off the Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day on Thursday. We're going into Memorial Day and Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day this week. It allows us to kind of step back and put things into perspective. And the first place to look when seeking perspective is to look where we were 75 years ago after the Holocaust and look where we are today with all the difficulties and all the problems and all the scoundrels and all the broken dreams. And what we've created during this short period of time is nothing short of a miracle with all the problems, right? With all the problems. As difficult as things may seem in the Jewish state now, or seemed yesterday, or may seem tomorrow, our grandparents going back 100 generations would have done anything in the world to exchange their peckle of problems for our peckle of problems, right? Perspective is needed, but it's sorely lacking. One place where I got this perspective, ironically enough, was 10 years ago when I was covering the swearing in ceremony of the new chief of staff, Benny Gantz, right? Benny Gantz was being sworn in by Benjamin Netanyahu, by Prime Minister Netanyahu. This is before all the political shenanigans and all the enmity. And at that ceremony, Netanyahu said something that I'll never forget. He said to Gantz, Gantz, your mother, right, was a Holocaust survivor who weighed 28 kilograms when she was liberated from Bergen-Belsen after the war. That family story, right, the Gantz family story, the journey from Bergen-Belsen to being the chief of staff of the Israeli army in one generation, attests to the transformation our people has undergone in the span of a single generation. And it's a perspective we need to keep in mind. The transformation from an exiled people, powerless to protect itself from its enemies, into a thriving, independent, bustling nation with one of the strongest military forces in the world, and a nation that controls its own destiny, right? I feel this intensely when I look at my own 4 proud, loud, unapologetic Israeli children, the grandkids of my late mother, whose parents sent her from Germany to Holland on Kristallnacht, who hid in Amsterdam during the war, eventually finding her way to Oakland, California to live with only one of 2 relatives who survived after the war, right? What I learned to appreciate in my mother was that she was able to go through so much, yet raise a relatively normal family and build a productive, constructive, creative life. And that's the same thing I've learned to appreciate over the years in Israel. That same characteristic, that same amazing life-affirming resilience. You want perspective, consider this, right? Our neighborhood, the Middle East, is in flames. It's imploding. It's imploding. Syria is self-destructing. Egypt is a basket case. Lebanon is teetering on the brink. Jordan, according to the king, had a coup attempt just a week ago. You look farther afield at Algeria, Libya, Iraq, Yemen, Iran. One country in this whole region is stable, though not politically stable, is secure, right? Is and flourishing, even with the the COVID virus is Israel. And considering everything around us, that's not a given. It's amazing, actually. If you would fly over the region, you look down, you would see that everything is up in flames except for one little dot, Israel, and also perhaps United Arab Emirates, which, thank God, now we have relations with, right? But we're in a pandemic year, and we're in the midst of a never-ending election season. So you're not going to hear any of that. I come from abroad, right? I come from Denver, as you can tell by my accent. I've been in Israel now for 37, 38 years, but I'm still an optimist, right? And I'm optimistic for two main reasons, and these are actually the reasons I enjoy living in the country. The first is the people's inner strength and resilience, and the second is its uncanny ability to solve problems, to cope with problems that are thrown in its direction. Regarding the resilience, right, you feel it now as we're coming out of the pandemic and the cities are returning to life. You go down to Yerushalayim now and the cities are coming back to life. Look, you're going to feel that resilience all over the world. That's not necessarily uniquely Israeli. But to really have felt Israeli resilience, you had to have been here during the Second Intifada, that period of mind-numbing violence from 2000 to 2005, when the buses were being blown up on the streets about every other week, right? But life went on, the country developed, people continued to come, the economy developed, people didn't leave, right? You had this incredible resilience that you felt every time you went downtown and you saw that the city was still alive. There's an uplifting, life-affirming resilience that makes you feel proud to be a part of in this country, and that gives you faith, or gives me faith in the strength and determination of the people, right? You always read about the happiness polls, right? The UN has a happiness polls. What are the happiest countries in the world? You look at the headlines and you're not going to think necessarily that Israel is going to be high up there, right? But it is. And I think that's a testament to this country's resilience and to its optimism. And this tremendous resilience provides hope in our ability, despite all the difficulties, to not only survive, but also to flourish. It also goes against the grain completely of the perception one walks away from when reading the headlines. I'll give you one example. Thomas Friedman wrote an editorial in the Times a couple of days ago talking about how Israel's situation with the ultra-Orthodox is unsustainable. He quoted one hell, right? I think that was a quote, that it's on the way to hell, on the highway to hell, and it's past the last rampart, right? And that it can't, there's no sustainable system that it can deal now with this growth in the ultra-Orthodox population. And I think what Friedman misses is the fact that this is also a country that's chafetz b'chaim, a country that desires life. And it realizes that if things get bad, if the formula ain't working, you'll change it, right? You'll change it. If you see that it's not sustainable to have 25% of the population not working, not paying taxes, you will create a system where that won't be the situation, where because you want the country to survive, that they will find an answer for that, as they found answers for many social ills or social problems in the past. So I'm optimistic because of the internal resilience and the strength of the people, and also because of an uncanny ability to find short-term solutions to problems. Israelis are great to finding short-term solutions to problems. We're not good at the long term, but we deal pretty well, although not politically right now, but we deal pretty well with strategic short-term problems. One of the country's aptitudes is finding short-term solutions. If there's a problem, you don't sit and hang your head and say, I can't solve it. You find a solution. And there's many, many examples of this. Right? The examples are numerous. 1991, for instance. In 1991, war in the Middle East changes forever. Why? What happens in 91? 91, we're not at war. What happens in 91 is George Bush goes into Iraq. And what does Saddam Hussein do? He flies his rockets onto Israel. From that moment on, war in the Middle East changed forever, right? Every confrontation since then, it hasn't been our tanks against their tanks in the Golan or in the Sinai. It's their rockets against our population centers. And 91, Israel realized that that's where the future was going, and you had to find a solution to it. You can't empty out large swaths of your country, right? You have to find a solution. So 91, they started to develop a 3-tiered anti-rocket umbrella, so that if the enemy fires its rockets, you'll be able to knock out a good number of them from the sky. Maybe not all of them, but a good number. You developed the arrow against Iran. You developed David's sling against Hezbollah in Lebanon. You developed Iron Dome against the Qassam rockets from Gaza, and you see how effective it was. And that's just that's an example of this mentality that if there's a problem, you find a solution to it. Terrorism. And I mentioned the Second Intifada. In 2002, Israel lost 456 people in 1 year to terrorism. I mean, it was incredible. It was mind-numbing, that terrorism. Last year, there were 3 terror fatalities. Right? What happened? It's not that people stopped wanting to blow you up, but you just figured out how to defend yourself better. You found solutions to it. You built a security barrier. You developed technology. You moved the troops back into the city. There was a problem. You found a solution. Right? You see this all the way through. You see this all over. With the tunnels. Remember in 2014 with the war in Gaza, you have the tunnels. How are we going to deal with the tunnels? You have the same thing with Lebanon in the north. Israel found, please God, they found a technology, developed a technology and able to snuff out these tunnels. So again, if there's a problem, you find a solution to it. What does it show? It shows that the country, to survive, it just can't sit on its hand and let things happen. Things do happen, but as they happen, Israel, for the most part, improvises, initiates, creates, and that's one of the secrets of the country's survival. We often hear about all the developments around us. Hezbollah getting stronger, Iran getting itself entrenched in Syria, marching towards nukes, Hamas getting better equipped. But you know what? So are we, right? And I'd venture we're doing it, we're developing at a quicker pace. If our enemies hit, we can hit back. If they develop tools to harm us, we can find the antidote. If they try diplomatic tricks to weaken us, we too can deflect them. It's not as if the other side is getting stronger and stronger and we're just sitting on our hands and letting everything happen. We're not a reed being pushed this way and that anymore by the rushing water, by external events. We're also in control of them. And I think we as Israelis and as the Jewish people, that's something we very much have to internalize, because that's something relatively new. This is not your grandmother's Israel, right? This is a serious country now with serious capabilities and an ability to kind of go with the flow and adapt and think quickly on its feet. I read something once that always struck with me about this Israeli mentality, or this ability to find short-term solutions. A guy wants to go to Mars, right? A guy wants to go to Mars. He goes to America. He says, build me a rocket to go to Mars, right? He goes to Huntsville, Alabama. He goes to NASA. He goes to MIT. Within 15 years, the Americans, with their wealth and their ingenuity, they have a rocket, takes the guy to Mars and brings him back home. It's a wonderful achievement. He comes to Israel and he says to the Israelis, build me a rocket to take me to Mars. He goes to the Technion, goes to the Weizmann Institute, right? He goes to these computer kids in the army. Within 3 years, Israelis have a rocket to take him to Mars. Doesn't bring him back home, but it takes him to Mars, right? And that's the mentality. The idea that if there's a problem, you solve the problem, you're going to get to Mars, you'll figure out how to get home, but first you got to get there. And that gives me a lot of optimism as to where this country can go. Now, when I say this around the Shabbat table, that I'm optimistic in light of our political mess, in light of the fractured political moment we're living in light of Iran and Syria, Hezbollah and Hamas and all the scandals, right? People will say, or my kids will say, Abba, you're not an optimist, you're a moron, right? I mean, what's there to be optimistic about when you have all that? When you have that, plus you have you have drunken drivers, and you have domestic violence, and you have all the internal problems of all the other countries of the world. And it's all there, right? That's all out there. I'm not denying that. But that's not all that there is. That's all we hear about. You open the papers and it's enough, to want to slit your wrist. I write the papers, it's enough for me to want to slit my wrist. That's all you hear about, especially during an election season, which we can't get out of now. And there's always, during that period, like I said in the beginning, there's an exaggeration of how bad things are. but that's not all that there is. There's also a vibrating, pulsating life here, full of incredible energy in every sphere, artistic, intellectual, economic, religious, even athletic right now. We have a player in the NBA who, by the way, on the night of Yom HaShoah, he wrote the Yizkor to remember on his tennis shoes, which I thought was very moving and which made the headlines here. In so many spheres, the cup in Israel is full. Science, technology, religion, economy. In a land where there's milk and honey, but no oil, though thank God, and this is changing our strategic situation, there's a lot of natural gas right now. But even water, you have to desalinate in order to recycle for agriculture. In a country like that, the achievements are actually amazing. Moshe Ya'alon, the former defense minister, told me once in an interview I did with him a few years ago, he ticked off all these achievements, everything that Israel's accomplished. And he said, we did all this in a land in which we have 2 lakes and one of them is dead, right? The economy, considering the pandemic, is doing well. The country has weathered COVID-19 better than most. Right? When you look at morbidity rates, if you look at the 27, 28 countries in the EU, there's only 3 who have a lower morbidity rate than we do. There's a standard of living in this country now that was unheard of when I arrived here 38 years ago, right? When I first came here, you had to wait, 2 years to get a phone. You had to stand in line for hours to pay a bill. Now every kid's got a phone, stuck glued to his ear. The sky isn't falling. The sky isn't falling. Then why do we think it is? And many of us do think it is, both here and Jews abroad. Why do we think it is? First of all, because that's who we are. We're a hypercritical people of others and of ourselves. As a people who complained in the desert for 40 years against Moses, believe me, we're going to fetch about Benjamin Netanyahu. At the Seder the other night, right? In the Seder, you've got that great song, Dayenu. Dayenu, it's a wonderful song, a song of great gratitude. If God had only taken us out of Egypt, that would have been enough. If he would have only led us in the desert for 40 years, that would have been enough. If he would have only given us the man, that would have been enough, right? I'm sitting there reading the song or singing the song with my kids, and I'm thinking to myself, who wrote this? Who wrote this? This is not a Jewish song, right? The Jewish people are not a Dayenu people. We're not a people of great gratitude. Some Protestant guy must have written that song. Why do we think the sky is falling? Because we expect more of ourselves. Thirdly, because we're a hyperbolic people. We take every problem and take it to its most extreme conclusion. It's like a kid who wakes up in the morning with a cough and his mother automatically runs and takes him to the emergency ward thinking he's got consumption, right? For instance, a bad law in the Knesset, and there will be bad laws in the Knesset, just as there are bad laws in every parliament in the world. They can't just be a bad law. It has to be a threat to democracy. An incident where some religious soldiers, because of a halachic reason,
Oh, we lost you there for a second, at least on my screen. Herb, you with us? All right, I think he's going to hopefully plug back in there. Can everybody hear me?
I'm back.
Okay, there we go. Excellent.
Sorry about that. So I'm going to start from the beginning. If Joe Biden doesn't call, right? I'm talking about how we take everything to the most extreme conclusions. If Joe Biden doesn't call for 29 days, it can't be just because he's got a lot of other things to do or that he's rearranging his priorities. It must mean that Israel and America are now on a collision course, right? We're hyperbolic. We take everything to the extreme. Fourth, why do we think the sky is falling? Because as a people, we just can't take good news, right? It's something about our makeup. We hear good news and we think someone's trying to pull the wool over our eyes. This is something that's very true in Israel. The best example of this, I think, has to do with rain, right? With rain. Rain is very important in Israel, right? The winter comes and we're always watching the rain. We're watching to see, how much is fall. Is the Kinneret rising or falling? but no matter how much it rains, it's never enough or in the right spots. When it rains so hard that they actually got to bring in the Navy to extract people from homes in Tel Aviv, they're saying, well, that's no good because all the water is flowing into the Mediterranean, right? If it floods near Haifa, as that happens a lot, we're saying that's not too much, that's not too good because the ground can absorb all the water. If it pours in Jerusalem, we'll be told that's not too good because it's dripping into the wrong aquifer. No matter where it rains or how much it rains, it's never good enough. We're always told that the water situation, despite the winter, we had a very wet winter this year, despite the winter, we're always told that the water situation is dire. We have a tendency as a people and as Israelis, if there's a silver lining, by God, we're going to go out there, we're going to find that cloud, right? That's how we are. That's how we operate. And finally, we think the sky is falling because we as a people are addicted to action, to crisis, to drama, right? We see ourselves at the center of the universe. And if there isn't a world-shattering event on the news every single day, right, we kind of pinch ourselves and wonder if we're still alive. And if there isn't an earth-shattering event on the news every day, we take something rather mundane and we make it earth-shattering. Yair Lapid right now is the head of this party named Yesh Atid. And his father, Tommy Lapid, was a longtime politician. He was a justice minister. He once wrote something that I always remember to kind of, I think, illustrates this point. He says that Israelis, we've lost our sense of proportion, right? He says, what'll happen? What'll happen in Israel is if a sewage pipe bursts in Tel Aviv, the main story in next day's Yediot Ahronoth newspaper is that the country's entire sewage system is on the cusp of destruction, right? We just take something and we blow it completely out of proportion. We fret, therefore we are, right? And I'm not minimizing that there's not things to worry about and fret about, but there is, but we have to keep it in perspective. And we also have to realize that we have the ability to deal with it. We have the ability to deal with things. Look, I often, before the pandemic, I used to speak to a lot of groups who came to Israel. And some of them from the US were here for the first time. And I noticed that oftentimes you had people who were kind of sorely disappointed when they arrived in the country. Right? They're disappointed because the Israel they arrived in was all too real. It was all too human. It was all too familiar. It wasn't the Israel of their dreams or their imaginations. For generations, Israel was idealized in the mind of the Jews. We were placed on a pedestal, right? The Jews loved it, but it was unrequited love. And like all unrequited love, love not consummated, it was pure and it was burning and it was intense. The Israel of the imagination was pure and unblemished. And in some ways, it's easier to have a love affair with a love who is distant and lives only in the imagination than actually having to deal with the reality of the man or woman who's sitting next to you. Dostoevsky once wrote that it's easy to love humanity. It's the guy on the train who's coughing that it's difficult to like. And this is very true in Israel, right? You ride the buses, you could have this love in your heart for Israel and the Jewish people. You ride the buses, sit next to a guy with falafel dripping down his beard, and it's kind of tough to like him. A few years ago, there was a great Israeli humorist named Ephraim Keinon who was talking about this penchant that we have in Israel of kind of blowing things out of proportion. And he likened Israel to a hand. And he said, if you take a hand and you put it under a magnifying glass, it's not attractive, right? It's not attractive. You see everything up close. It doesn't look so great, right? But if you move the hand back and you see that the hand is attached to the arm and the arm is attached to the shoulder and the shoulder does the doing of the mind, then you realize that it is indeed a wondrous thing. And he said, that's how you have to look at Israel. You have to kind of move back a little bit and see the entire picture. He took that a little too far. He went to live in Switzerland. You don't have to go that far. You don't have to move that far back. But I think his point was well taken. Let me just finish by just relating a story. And I've said this over many times again because it always left an impression on me. Joel Roth was bringing a group of birthright kids to Israel when birthright was still coming to Israel, right before the pandemic, and he spoke once about his experience, and he said that he once took a group there, and he was taking these birthright kids, and these kids are oftentimes kids who have no sense of Yiddishkeit, no sense of Jewish identity, no sense of what Israel is, And he was bringing them, as they always do on the first night in the trip, he was bringing them to the Western Wall. He was bringing them to the Kotel. And he wanted to fire them up so that then they were looking at the Kotel. They weren't just standing there looking at a pile of rocks with some doves sitting on it, right? So this is what he told the kids. He said, your great-great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents almost certainly didn't know each other. They probably came from different settlements in the Pale of Settlements or from different lands. They spoke different languages or different dialects of different languages. They all eked out their living in a different manner, and they all had different levels of religious commitment and observance. But, he said, your great-great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents share two things in common, two things. They all spent their lives yearning to touch the stones of the Western Wall of the Kotel, and they all knew that they never would, right? That we can do that. That when there's no pandemic, you can land in Israel and touch the stones of the Kotel, in a land in which we control our own destiny, in which we're making the decisions, the good ones and the bad ones, and in which we're speaking to our kids in a language that was dead 120 years ago, in which we're living our lives by the rhythm of a Jewish calendar, and in which we're defending ourselves by ourselves. The fact that we can do that is an amazing, wondrous thing, and it's something that we should keep in mind. And this, like I said in the beginning, this is a good time in the calendar to keep that in mind after Yom HaShoah, becoming a bit before Yom Ha'atzmaut. It's that perspective which is important to keep in mind, even when we're facing as difficult a political moment as we're facing right now. So let me stop there, and I'll be happy to take any questions on that or on anything else.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much, Herb. That was fantastic. As usual, after most of these, I prepared, 20, 30 some odd questions and feel somewhat speechless. But in any event, time is running. And so let's dive in to a few things, and then we're going to look to some of the questions from the audience. But one thing that occurs to me as you talk is when I studied the history of Zionism, there was sort of the normalization of Jewish life. And I don't remember, was it Aleph Dalet Gordon? Somebody may correct me, but are we still trying to wrestle with getting to a different type of Zionism, that normalization of everyday life? You talked about it a little bit, but it has significant ramifications for how Israel deals with its immediate neighbors and the rest of the world, let alone a Jewry in the United States.
Look, I think one of the things, and this is something I feel very much raising my kids here. One of the things my kids wear their Judaism very naturally, right? It's natural. It's a part of their life. They don't question it. I mean, they don't, it's not, they're not trying to figure out who they are first, an American or a Jew. They're a Jew. It's natural. They feel comfortable with it. They feel confident with it. So in that sense, I think there's been a normalization of Jewish life because you can just be. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the beauties of living here, right? You can just be a Jew. It's easy to be a Jew. You don't have to explain. You don't have to defend, right? The anti-Semitism, it's bad, but you don't worry about it to the same extent as you do abroad because here you feel, I can deal with it. I can, the anti-Semites can talk, but we can respond. There's a normalization in that sense. There's also, and I think you see this with the Abraham Accords. I think there's a growing understanding in the region that we're here to stay, right? That after 73 years, this country ain't going anywhere, and that as a result of that, it has a lot to offer. You might as well, deal with it. You might as well, just kind of cooperate with it because it can make things better for everyone. So I think you're starting to see that. I don't want to, I'm not naive. That's not something that's swept the entire region, but I would not underestimate the importance of the Abraham Accords and how that's changed kind of the mindset. I mean, think for a minute, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, you had a Holocaust Remembrance Day ceremony in Dubai. Right. I mean, think of that for a minute, right? The Arab countries for many years, they downplayed the Holocaust if they didn't deny the Holocaust because, it was because the Holocaust in their minds, Israel came to exist. Now you're having a Holocaust Remembrance Day in Dubai. I mean, that's a significant event which
Sure.
is, I think, it was symbolic of a certain process of normalization that we're at the beginning of, right? And I think that's something that gives me a great deal of optimism.
So let me ask you along those lines, maybe one, and I don't want to spend too much time on elections, but one practical election question, and then one theoretical one. From the practical side, term limits. It would seem to me that egos aside, one incredible benefit of prime ministerial term limits would be the de facto grooming of other leaders that seem to just sit on the sidelines for fear of being continually beaten up by the system. Talk for a moment about term limits, and then I have my theoretical question for you. I'm going to ask you to wear a Palestinian hat for a second, so I give you fair warning. But term limits.
Look, term limits. I want to throw out one statistic. Okay, Netanyahu 2 weeks ago passed the 15-year mark as an Israeli prime minister. He was a prime minister from 96 to 99 for 3 years. He's now been a prime minister since 2009, 12 years consecutively, 15 years. Okay, this is a country that's only 73 years old. That means that over 20% of the country's entire history, we've been governed by Netanyahu. That's an incredible statistic. And if you put together Netanyahu's 15 years with Ben-Gurion's 13 years, 28 years, 38, almost 40% of the country's history was governed by two men. That's not necessarily a healthy place to be, right? That's having, lahavdil, that's having the US one president for 50 years, right? Imagine that. Imagine the US president for 50 years. So I don't think it's healthy in that extent. It's also what it's done is because every prime minister thinks that he's going to be there forever and wants to be there forever. What this means is he doesn't groom anybody, right? He doesn't bring anybody up in his party, because why bring somebody up who's going to be a competitor for you, who's going to be a threat to you? In fact, Netanyahu, everybody who does come up as a threat, like Keinon right now, the New Hope Party, he pushes to the side. Moshe Kachalon. So I think term limits would be something that could, go a certain distance in healing the Israeli political system. In order to do that, though, you have to have the parties agree to it.
Sure.
Some of the parties who ran against Bibi are saying this is the first thing they would like to do, but we'll see if they'll have a coalition to do it.
Yeah. Would a constitutional convention occur after term limits or before, or never the twain shall meet, or what do you think about?
And never the twain shall meet. Israel's not going to have a constitution. And this goes back to 48 when they say, if you have a constitution, it's as if you're replacing the Torah, right? And we don't want to do that. We can go through with basic laws and this and that. Look, I don't think our political problem right now is not that we don't have a constitution. Our political problem right now is that the country is split evenly. Now, this is interesting because in the past when you thought about splits in Israel, you thought between the left and the right, between pro-settlement, anti-settlement, between pro-compromise with the Palestinians, anti-compromise. That's not the split anymore, right? That's not the split. The split is over one issue, and that's Bibi Netanyahu, right? Every one of the last 4 elections has been a referendum on Netanyahu. What we see is that the country is split in half over Netanyahu. Half the people think he's a scoundrel and needs to leave, and half think he's a saint who's done wonderful things for the country and should not be hounded out. That's the dividing line. Now, if he were to get up tomorrow, right, and leave, this crisis would be over, right? I mean, you would be able to form a government like that.
Yes.
But he's not going to do that.
That would imply that if he were president, there would be a government of 80 seats in unity. But we'll leave that for another day.
There's talk of that. There's talk of him becoming president and then somebody else becoming the head of Likud, and then you'll have a government within minutes.
So here's my theoretical for you. With the Abraham Accords moving at pace, and they do have momentum, if you're advising Abbas, if you're advising the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, what would you advise them as momentum moves very fiercely in this direction of partnership with all of our other neighbors?
Look, that's an interesting question because I think one thing that the Palestinian Authority has to pay attention to is what happened on the Arab street, on the Israeli Arab street, because the Abraham Accords trickled down to the Israeli Arabs as well. And we saw this in the last election where a guy from an Islamic movement ran on his own saying that I am willing to deal with the right wing. I'm willing to deal with any Israeli government. Right, which was revolutionary because up until that time, the Israeli Arabs said they can't deal with Netanyahu, they can't deal with the Israeli right. But if the Israeli Arabs, right, who are concerned about what's happening on their street, there's rampaging violence on their street, they need billions of dollars of funding that they're not getting, right? If they look at the United Arab Emirates, which is kind of a serious country, and they see that the ruler of the UAE is saying, you know what, I feel for the Palestinians, but I have my own interests to deal with. And I'm going to deal with the government in place in Israel because it's good for me. Then the Israeli Arabs are saying the same thing, right? I have to deal with what's good for me. And so I'm going to, the Palestinians, it's an important issue, but it's not my number one priority. So that's a change that's taking place among the Israeli Arabs. And I think that's something that Mahmoud Abbas, that the Palestinian Authority president and the Palestinian Authority has to look at. This trend, this move, both among Israeli Arabs and in the Arab world saying enough is enough, right? You can't hold us hostage. We want to deal with Israel because it's good for us. It will give us benefits. You can't hold us hostage anymore. I think they have to realize the trend lines and hopefully draw the conclusions. And what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that they're not going to get everything they want, right? That they're going to have to compromise to a degree that they were not willing to do in the past. I mean, that would be my advice. And again, you look at what's going on in the Arab world and among the Israeli Arabs, they're losing patience with the Palestinian maximalist demands.
So I think this is a perfect time to segue into the other Herb Keinon. I'm going to remind everybody, I'm not getting paid for this, but this is available on Amazon, French fries and pita. But quite seriously, though, you once said life is made up of small moments amid the mundane. And I think you actually just touched on that in the political context when you talked about Israeli Arabs and in general the Abraham Accords. I'm a big believer that, life happens between the headlines, but it's at the headline moments that we also have opportunities to define ourselves and our society. So in French fries and in pita, you address some of the more mundane day-to-day aspects of life that make up the whole. How does politics matter if life occurs between the headlines? Does that day-to-day life really drive the politics? And are we seeing that happen not just within Israel, but outside Israel?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. What's interesting about Israel, again, if you read the headlines, in Israel, you could walk away with the sense that everybody is at everybody's throat, right? That this country is on the verge of just tearing each other apart. But then when you go into reserves, or I don't go into reserves anymore, but when my kid goes into reserves, right, and he's in there with people he's from the left and the right, the religious and the non-religious, you see that there's a common denominator here, at least among the Jewish population, which still makes up, 78% of the population. There's still a strong common denominator, a common history, a common destiny, a common fate that binds people together and allows them, at least at a personal level, to get over all these humps, right? The rhetoric at the political level is strident and it's ear-shattering. But then when you sit down at, again, in the reserves or at the Shabbat table with different people, it's a completely different ballgame because there is a lot here that unifies the nation, the people. And I think that's one thing, again, I'm not an expert on what's going on in America, but I think that's one kind of difference between the fractures that we have here and the fractures you have in America. I'm not sure in America you have that common glue that you have to the degree that you have it here in Israel.
No, fair point. So I want to bring up something that similarly along these lines that Thomas Friedman just mentioned recently. He's written a book, The World is Flat. I forget, there's another title that is of similar effect. And he recently spoke at the Hebrew University Landmark Conference stating that the world is now fused. And in essence, the butterfly effect has taken hold. And frankly, COVID has shown us, in fact, the human side of the true butterfly effect. But how does that affect Israel today if we are all fused? Here we are all in one place on Zoom when in fact we're all over the place. I see a benefit in many ways to Israel of that fusion, but a danger. Israel has been able to not just export technology, but television shows, great chefs. You've mentioned the NBA. So Israel is in its, again, most mundane, most French fries and pita element, reaching into parts of the world in this flatness that it hasn't before. Can that tilt the PR? Here's really the crux of my question. We still have a huge PR issue, BDS on campus, et cetera. But can these other shifts and momentums, help drive and change that? And how do we continue to mine a better PR fix in a fused world?
Look, I think that is happening. I think it's been happening over the last decade. I think one of Netanyahu's crowning achievements is going to be his ability to leverage Israel's value added into diplomatic currency, right? I mean, Israel has made incredible strides over the last 10 years in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in the Arab world, not because they've fallen in love with the Zionist idea, right? But because they realize that, well, we've got some stuff that they could use. We've got stuff they can need. They need technology. I mean, how to secure your ports, how to secure your airports, water irrigation, agriculture. These are things that Israel now is giving to the world. And that's why Israel's diplomatic relations with a lot of these countries has taken off. So I think we're seeing this. I think the fusion you're talking about is good for us. Because with fusion, everybody comes interconnected, and Israel does have a lot of things that other people want and other people need, and that's something that can only benefit us. Again, you see it now with the Abraham Accords. The leaders of the UAE did a cost benefit analysis,
Sure.
And they realized that the benefits of dealing with Israel far outweighed the cost of what they might pay on the Arab street or what they might lose as far as their ideological purity is concerned. It was worth it to them because of what Israel has to offer, and that's something that's very positive. I said in the beginning, this is no longer your grandmother's Israel. I remember, I knew in my grandmother's day, the only thing Israel had to offer the world was the Jaffa orange and the Uzi, submachine gun, right? Well, those days are long gone. We're at a different place, and I think that we've been able to leverage that very much to our advantage.
No, well said. Well said. We're going to take some questions from everybody. So get yourselves ready. There are some people who've already written in the chat window. I did want to touch my last question before opening it up really on the U.S. Jewish community and relationship with Israel. One organization, for example, that seems to be changing its posture a little bit, or has altered or pivoted its posture a little bit, is many organizations in the United States, but the ADL, for example, seems to have a much more universalistic message that it's delivering. In general, there seems to be no lack of criticism of Israel and Israeli policies from U.S. Jewish organizations, which of course makes it difficult to have some kind of a unified message to the rest of the world. Maybe we don't need a unified message, but talk for a moment as an American, as an Israeli. How do you and other Israelis see that kind of dialogue? Welcome, unwelcome? Is criticism embraced or rejected? There's a lot to cover and we don't have much time, but touch on that for a moment.
Look, I think the main thing to remember when looking at the whole, divide, if you will, between American and Israeli Jewry is the understanding that, despite the fact that we are one people, as the slogans say, we live in extremely different realities. We live in extremely different realities, right? I mean, American Jewry lives in the, up until now, probably, American Jewry lives in the most welcoming society that the Jewish people have ever been a part of, right? The fears for the American Jews, the concerns of the American Jews are not existential. Israeli Jews live in the most dangerous neighborhood in the world, and they deal with real issues of personal security on a day-to-day basis, right? So your concerns are different. And as a result of the different concerns, you have different priorities, right? I think that, many Israelis, many Americans looking at Israeli Jews kind of sat there with their jaws wide open. Why do the Israelis like Donald Trump so much, right? I mean, this guy is not a prince of men, right? He's got, huge problems, personality problems, policy problems, whatever. Why is it that the Israelis like him? And the reasons that the Israelis liked him and why the Israelis would have voted for him is because of one simple thing. He's done good things for Israel, right? Israelis didn't embrace Trump the man. They embraced what Trump did for Israel, right? That's because that's where we sit. That's what's important to us. Whether or not we're going to be able to keep the Golan Heights, that's the important thing for us, much more than, Stormy Daniels. In America, for American Jews, Israel, when they go to the polls, it's not their top priority item. It's not even in the top 10, apparently. It's way down on the list. And that's because, they live, you guys are living in a different reality. So I think the understanding of those different realities will allow us to deal with how, is an Israeli, why American Jews, are so anti-Trump or so pro-Biden, helps me understand that because of where they sit. And also, I think it's important for the American Jews to understand, like, one thing that Israelis were kind of dumbfounded about was the criticism that Israel was getting from American Jewry because of the fight over the Iran deal under Obama, right? Because American Jews didn't want, Israel to go to battle with a Democratic president. But the way Israeli Jews viewed it was this was an existential threat. So again, it comes from where you sit is how you view things. So we're sitting in different realities. And as a result, we're viewing things from different perspectives and different realities. And it's natural. And it's not necessarily the end of the world. I mean, obviously, Israelis would like to see, more political support for Israel from American Jews, just as American Jews would probably like to see the Israeli government speak out more intently about, about dog whistles of anti-Semitism in America. But that's where we're at. And another just an interesting thing here is the Israeli polity, the Israeli politics has moved right. This is a whole nother lecture, but the Second Intifada had a huge impact on Israel. Israel has moved to the right at the same time where American Jewry is moving more progressive, or are progressive and moving more progressive. So there's going to be tension because of those differing worldviews. It's the reality. I mean, is it ideal? It's not ideal, but it's also, I don't think it's the end of the world. We live in different realities.
Okay, some quick ones that I think synthesize some questions we've had. The Iran deal, will it come back in your view or not?
Look, I mean, it seems that the Americans are intent to or want to get back into the Iranian deal, but not at any price. They're not willing to do it at any price. It's kind of up to the Iranians. It'll see, we have to wait and see what the Iranians are going to, where are they willing to compromise? Are they willing to compromise? Will they talk about the ballistic missiles? Will they talk about their nefarious actions in the region? We know what the intention of the Americans are, but we don't exactly know how far the Iranians are going to give. That being said, I would note that I think Israel, when Israel says that they are not going to allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon, I think they mean it. And I don't think that necessarily means that you have to wonder, are the bombers going to be coming in from the southeast or the southwest, right? Because the Iranians have been trying to get a bomb now for 40 years, for 35 years. They haven't done it. They haven't done it not necessarily because they're not a smart and capable people, but they've not done it because things are happening to keep them from getting it. I don't know if you've been following the news today, but today in the nuclear site in Natanz, the centrifuge site, there was an electronic outlet outage. They started to spin their new super fast centrifuges, and they couldn't do it because there was an outage. Who's responsible for the outage? We don't know, but there was an outage. So I think that sends a message that there will be forces out there who are going to try to keep the Iranians from getting the nukes, even if they sign on to this new deal.
Okay, so in our last 60 some odd seconds, I'm not going to ask you to project out 73 years, but give us a decade or two maybe. Is there some form of a Palestinian state as the other countries in the region begin to work closely with Israel? Does that change things?
Look, I'm not sure if you're going to see a Palestinian state in the sense of a state as we know it. Might there be a Palestinian entity which has greater powers than it has now, but doesn't have the ability to threaten Israel in any way? You might see something like that. It depends on leadership. It depends on leadership on both sides. The Palestinians have an election coming up. If they vote in Hamas, right, then that doesn't bode well for the next decade, because who knows when there'll be other elections. If they don't vote in Hamas, if they vote in kind of new leadership who's willing to look at solutions beyond what have been tried and failed over since 1993, since Oslo, then we might move forward. I think that what many Israelis have come to the conclusion at this point, even those who want to see a two-state solution, that there's not going to be necessarily, you're not going to snap your finger, you're going to have a resolution to the conflict. You're not going to be able to solve the conflict right now. I think the Biden administration also has come to that conclusion, which is why they haven't made it a big priority. I think where people are at, including the Israeli Arabs, including the Gulf countries, is trying to manage the solution in a much better manner, right? So there's less friction. So there's more, you can give the Palestinians more on the West Bank. You can manage it in a much better way. And it doesn't have to be all peace or all war. Hopefully you can get to a better place. And then once you're at the better place, maybe a certain dynamic will be created that can lead to something better in the future. But I think what's important, even for the next 10 to 20 years, is to have realistic expectations, right? Don't set the bar too high, because if you set the bar too high and you don't jump over it, you're gonna have a lot of frustrated people, which is what we saw after Oslo and then into the Second Intifada.
And last but not least then, just to the heart of Tzionut, the heart of Zionism and Aliyah, what do you see as potentially happening with Aliyah, with the Zionist ideology over the next 5 to 10 years? What are the things that will help continue to lift that?
Look, I give you another interesting statistic. I like statistics. Right? I just like baseball, so I like statistics. I moved here pretty much in 1980. I was a student in 1980. I've been here pretty much since 1980. When I came in 1980, the population stood at 4.3 million people, and I think 3.8 million Jews. Okay, today there were more Jews in America by far. Today, Yom Ha'atzmaut, you're talking about a country of 9.3 million people and almost 7 million Jews, 6.8 million Jews, which means in the 40 years that I've been here, right, the country has doubled. The population of the country has doubled. And it's doubled at a time when you're constantly reading about all these articles in the newspaper, how, everybody smart wants to go move to Silicon Valley, and they're fed up with politics. Everybody's going to leave. All these stories about all Israelis want to leave, they can only leave. Despite all those stories, the population has doubled in the time that I've been here. There's a stronger commitment to this country, to Jewish history, Jewish destiny, and Judaism than I think we give ourselves credit for. I mean, I'm very optimistic about Zionism, right? I mean, this is the place where you can live a full Jewish life, right? And I think that has attraction. That has attraction to people. So, I mean, am I expecting a massive aliyah from America? No, I mean, the numbers, it's incredible. The numbers of immigrants who've come from America since 1948 is about 150,000 people, right? 150,000 people in 73 years. That's nothing. That's nothing. Why? Because America is a very comfortable place for Jews. But this is also a good, comfortable place for Jews right now. It ain't going anywhere. It's getting stronger. It's getting more developed. We're a serious country, so I think that will attract people. And you can have a reality that we have now, where you're going to have two centers. You'll have two Jewish centers. But for me, I moved to this country from Denver, from Colorado, not because I didn't like Denver, Colorado, but because when I came here as a junior at Hebrew University, I came here in 1980, and I remember thinking to myself, because I was born after 48, right? I was born, there was a state of Israel. I kind of took it for granted that there was always going to be a state. And then when I came and I realized that's not a given, right? There are people who don't want it to be. So if you don't come here, you don't put your money where your mouth is, there might not be a state. So that was the ideological underpinning that brought me to Israel. Also, the realization that it's a good place to be a Jew. It's a natural place to be Jewish, which is something that I wanted to give my kids, and now that I want to give my grandchildren. And I thank God for that, right? I mean, that was a life-changing moment, a life-changing year, and it's worked out.
Well, Herb, this has been a pleasure. Toda rabba lecha. Thank you, everybody else, for joining in. As you had emailed me previously, we have questions that could have taken us several hours, so maybe we'll have a redux at some point. Hopefully, there'll be some prime minister by that time. And again, Toda rabba lecha. Chag Sameach for this week. And we will hopefully see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have
a good evening. A good day.
Thank you.